Hello, it's Chino here. If you like chess openings, you're in the right place. This is part 3 of a 4-part series on the Scotch Gambit. So after the opening moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, the key move in the Scotch Gambit, pawn takes d4, and bishop to c4. In the first two parts of this 4-part series, we looked at the key move knight f6, which is the most popular try. But the next most popular try in this position is bishop to c5, and that's what we'll look at today. Now here the key move, and by far the most ambitious, is pawn to c3, gambiting a pawn. Now the main line continues with knight to f6, but just before we look at that, let's look at some of the alternatives for black. Now the first one, and one you probably face a lot in online blitz and against less experienced players, is the move pawn takes c3, trying to win a pawn. But the problem with that move is white can continue with bishop takes f7 check, and after the compulsory or almost compulsory king takes f7, we see queen to d5 check, and after the king moves, say, to f8, queen takes c5 check, and we can see the white has temporarily regained his pawn, and black can continue with queen to e7 and trying to force an exchange of queens. And in this position, white has two options, and the simplest of the two options is queen takes e7, knight takes e7, and knight takes c3, where we see the materials equal for both sides, but black's king has lost castling rights, so white would have a little bit of an advantage, the better coordinated pieces. Yeah, and would be ahead in development ever so slightly, because I think black's going to have to waste a couple of moves to get this king and rook, in better position. So, for example, king to f7, rook to f8, king to g8, etc. If we just go back to the position after, I think it was queen to e7. So yeah, it was after the position after queen takes c5 check and queen to e7. We saw the simple response, queen takes e7 and knight takes c3. But a more ambitious try, based on some analysis with chess engines, is queen to e3. Just offering just playing a gambit style. And the point here is that after pawn takes b2 and bishop takes b2, white's going to have a very big lead in development. But this would be more suited to attacking and tactical type players. Yeah. Okay. Just going back to the key position after move 5, where I played pawn to c3, we've just looked at pawn takes c3 and what happens after bishop takes f7. Two other tries for black in this position. Well, pawn to d3 and pawn to d6. So let's quickly look at pawn to d6. And now this move is not so bad. It's underestimated by theory, but it's the move black would play if he wants to avoid, theoretical discussions. But I think after the simple pawn takes d4, and the bishop has to move. So bishop to b6 is the best square for the bishop. Bishop to b5, threatening to win material with pawn to d5. So black plays bishop to d7. Yeah, after knight to c3, the game just develops along normal lines. So white would just castle king side, play h3, maybe bishop to f4 or g5. And black could play, say, knight to e7, castle king side, etc. But both sides would just, develop normally, where white would have a small advantage because this bishop is a bit locked out of the game by the pawn on d4. But yeah, this is one worth exploring as black if you're trying to avoid theoretical type positions. But yeah, I think white would retain a small advantage in the ensuing positions. And now going back to the key position after pawn to c3, we've looked at pawn takes pawn, and we've looked at the less theoretical pawn to d6. And the other interesting try, and this is played a lot even by strong players, especially when they're playing weaker players, is this move pawn to d3. And the point is, black doesn't want white to capture on d4, or didn't want white to capture on d4 to gain a big pawn center, so played d3 instead. And I think the thing to note about this is, yeah, this knight doesn't have the natural c3 square to go to because of this pawn. So yeah, those are some of the advantages of this move. Now, white can just simply, capture the pawn with bishop or with queen. But yeah, most people, or most of the games I've seen, white's try to expand on the queen side first with pawn to b4, and after bishop to b6, pawn to a4, with the immediate threat of pawn to a5 trapping the bishop. So in this position, black's advised to do something about the threat and would usually play pawn to a6. And that moves better than pawn to a5 because that would have been met by b5 when the knight would have to move. Yeah. So yeah, after this move, a6, in my database, there are quite a few games where whites play queen to b3, but it doesn't cause black any particular problems after queen to e7. So in this position, I'm just recommending the white plays castles kingside, with a small plus. I mean, white can regain the pawn on d3 at any time, has a bit more space on the queen side, and is ready to meet moves like knight to f6 with pawn to e5. Yeah, so in this position, I mean, black can continue with pawn to d6 with an acceptable game. But just to point out something here is knight to f6 would be ill-advised because, I mean, white can chase the bishop first on the queen side with pawn to a5, and after bishop to a7, pawn to e5 when black's in a bit of trouble. Now, knight to g4 isn't such a great move because of bishop to g5 threatening the queen, and after the exchanges with f6, pawn takes f6, etc. I mean, white would emerge with a better position, but not to digress too much, pawn to d5, the typical counter-attacking move for black in these types of positions, isn't particularly good here because white can play the intermezzo, bishop takes a6, and after pawn takes a6, pawn takes f6, pawn takes f6, and you see the black's position, well, his pawn structure is ruined. I mean, rook to e1 check would just be, this would just be a huge position for white. I mean, the pawn's going to fall next, and there's all these weaknesses around the black king. And going back a couple of moves, so I think it was after pawn takes f6. If black had tried queen takes f6 instead, well, rook to e1 check as well, would have been good for white, because after say something like king to f8, bishop to a3, and there's a strong threat of pawn to b5, with a discovered attack on the king. So yeah, so just going back to that key position after pawn to d3. I think after the expansion, with b4, bishop to b6, after the expansion on the king side, queen side rather, white should just go castles king side. Okay, now we've looked at some of the lesser known or lesser tried alternatives for black. Let's go to the main line. So yeah, in the position after pawn to c3, we've looked at pawn takes pawn, we've looked at pawn to d3, pawn to d6. But yeah, the main line is knight to f6. Yeah, and this move, with correct play, offers black a good game. So equal position at least. So let's see what happens in the main line. So after pawn to e5, which is white's natural response, pawn to d5, we see that counter-attacking move, which is typical in these positions. And by far the strongest move for white in these positions is bishop to b5, just taking the bishop away from the attack of the pawn. And now this knight has to move. Yes, after knight to e4, and pawn takes d4. And what we see here is white has a strong center, and if you like, a protected pawn on e5. And there are two key positions for black here. Bishop to b6 is by far the most popular. But bishop to b4 check is also okay. It's underestimated by theory, I think. I mean, after bishop to b4 check, I think of white's alternatives. Bishop to d2 is the strongest. And if black were to capture the bishop on d2 with the knight, trying to win a bishop pair, well then simply knight takes d2. And if both sides castle, here in this position, black often plays bishop to d7. And note there's a small threat here. The threat is knight takes e5 and winning material. So to avoid this, white would have to play bishop to e2 with an equal game. So just to illustrate that trap, rook to c1 loses material to knight takes e5. And the point is, if white captures the knight, the bishop captures the bishop, and black would emerge or pawn up. But yeah, as long as white avoids this trap, it should just be an equal game. Okay, so going back to the position after pawn takes d4, we've just looked at bishop to b4 check and bishop to d2, etc., which leads to an equal position. And bishop to b6 is the more popular move in the position, and yeah, leads to some interesting play. So, for example, after knight to c3, natural developing move for white, and black would usually castle kingside. Note, if we take that back, the bishop to g4, trying to win the pawn on d4 after exchanges on f3, would simply be met by bishop to e3. So yeah, going back, so in the position after knight to c3, so rather than try this cheaper with bishop to g4, black would usually castle kingside. But here white just continues developing naturally bishop to e3. Now the main line is actually bishop g4, which transposes to the line we just talked about. But I just need to point out a few things here. Pawn to f5 is sometimes seen by black trying to make this bishop uncomfortable. But I think white just has a simple response, pawn to g3, stopping the f4 push. So yeah, so taking that back, what are the other alternatives? Pawn to f6 is premature in this position. So normally this would be a good way for black to counter in the center in these sorts of positions, but in this exact position, it's a bit premature. And the reason is because of this very key move, queen to b3. Okay, so immediately there's the trap of knight takes, well, not a trap. There's a threat of knight takes e4 when black would be unable to recapture the knight because of this pin on the diagonal. Yeah, and if knight takes c3, white has this interesting intermezzo, bishop takes c6 first, and after pawn takes c6, queen takes c3 with an advantage. Reason is, yeah, this pawn's a bit weak, and black would be forced to defend it with the bishop. But that pawn's going to remain backward for a long time. I mean, if you're a positional player, you'll quickly notice that white can keep a bind on this square after moves like knight to d2 and knight to b3 at some point. Okay, so going back to the position after bishop to e3, so we've looked at f5 and g3, and we've we've looked at f6, which is premature, because of the queen b3 move. And the other try for black in this position is usually knight to e7. And yeah, that knight, yeah, moves away from a possible exchange on c6, and gives black the option of playing, c6 at some point in the game as well. But in this position, I think white could just simply keep an advantage with bishop to d3. So trying to avoid, a tempo for black after the move c6. And here we see white's threatening to win material on e4. Now usually knight takes c3. Black tries to avoid this move if at all possible, because that just helps strengthen white's central pawn structure. But in this position, yeah, bishop to f5 is possible to defend the knight on e4. But the move that I've seen most in the games in my database is pawn to f5, which is the other way of defending the knight. But this move has a dual threat. It not only defends the knight, it also threatens pawn to f4 at some point to make this bishop feel uncomfortable. But here we see a very instructive continuation by white. So knight to e2. I'd give this an exclamation mark, and we'll see why in a minute. This move stops pawn to f4. And even if black were to play knight to g6, trying to insist on pawn to f4, well, white has this interesting counter with pawn to h4, and here to illustrate what the merits of this move are. If black were to continue pawn to f4, the simple retreat of bishop to c1 reveals, the point of white's play. I mean, pawn to h5 is coming next, and once that knight moves, knight takes if f4 would regain a pawn. Well, not regain a pawn, win a pawn. And now in this position, black can still, get a reasonable position by playing the aggressive pawn to c5. But I don't think too many people would see that move in a real game unless they've studied the position before, or they had good tactical and positional judgment. It's worth pointing out here that a move like bishop to g4 wouldn't really help, because we see this typical white response in these sort of positions, queen to b3, when again the threat is bishop takes e4, taking advantage of this pin on the diagonal. And it's also worth noting here that if black were to play bishop to f3 first, that would be the biggest blunder ever. Then pawn takes f3 would trap this knight, so the knight would have to maybe, be exchanged on f2 after knight takes f2, when white would be well and truly winning. So yeah, so just going back to the key position then in the opening after bishop to e3, we've looked at pawn to f6, we've looked at pawn to f5, we looked at knight e7. Well, the main line, and our main line here, so the game that's occurred the most in my database, is the position after bishop to g4. Now this leads to an interesting series of moves, starting with the move pawn to h3. And the point here is if bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, would give white a good control of the center pawns. So for that reason, black would usually play bishop to h5. And now, believe it or not, in this position, white would castle kingside. Now in this position, this is the right time to play pawn to f6. The typical counter-attacking idea for white, for black, sorry, trying to undermine white central dominance. But here white, practice has shown that white can even play this move, pawn to g4. I mean, it looks as though it's weakening the squares around the king, but concrete analysis shows that white's fine and maybe even slightly better in these positions. To illustrate, after pawn to g4, well, bishop to e8 is our main line, but let's see what happens to after bishop to g6. Now, that is typically a desirable square for the bishop in these sorts of positions. But here white has an interesting try, so rook to c1. This is better than the move that I saw in most games in my database, pawn takes f6. But rook to c1 creates a small nasty threat of knight takes. Oops, let's take that back. So after rook to c1, there's a nasty threat of knight takes d5. The point being the queen won't be able to capture the knight because of this bishop to c4 threat. Okay, so in this position, black would probably be forced to play knight takes c3. But after rook takes c3, we see, there's this pressure on the c file for white. Okay, so just going back, so after pawn to g4, bishop to e8 is the advisable move. I mean, we've just seen bishop to g6. Not posing white any particular problems. So bishop to e8, and that bishop is at least defending, this c6 square. But in this position, white can play pawn to a4 with the immediate threat of pawn to a5 winning the bishop. So black has to do something about it. You don't want the bishop trapped after, say, bishop takes c6 and pawn to a5. So a6 is the most popular try in that position. But after bishop takes f6, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6 and queen to b3, we see this idea again of knight takes e4, taking advantage of this diagonal. So here black, as usual, would be forced to play knight takes c3, pawn takes c3. And this is where, theory, almost just about ends. So in this position, black is at a crossroads. What does he do? Does he capture on e5, or does he play the pawn push to f5? So it's just what quickly pointing out that pawn takes e5 is not such a great move, because after knight takes e5, this knight has a dominant, position on e5. He can't be moved from this outpost. And the other thing worth pointing out here is this bishop is pretty much locked out the game because of this pawn on d4. So this position is positionally much better for white. Just one more note to make is queen to h4 doesn't really cause white any problems, because white can easily defend with king to g2. And pawn to f4 would follow next with a dominant position. Note that pawn to h5 trying to weaken these pawns won't be such a good idea. For example, because of the simple, pawn to f4 could just ignore it, or even, rook a to e1. The point being that this knight defends the g4 square. Even looking at this position, you're probably wondering, well, why not knight g6? Well, knight g6 can be played as well to win material. So h5 would be ill-advised for black. Okay, so going back to the position after and pawn takes c3. So we see the pawn takes e5 isn't such a good idea because the knight would gain an outpost on e5. And so another try for black could be pawn to f5, and trying to weaken the position around the white king. But after this move, which I'll give an exclamation mark, king to g2, and you'll see why in a minute, it turns out that the position is still dynamically equal. And actually, if black were not careful, he could end up in a slightly worse position. So let's try a few moves here for black. Pawn takes g4, trying to weaken the squares around the king. Doesn't do much because of this move, pawn takes g4. And after something like queen to c8 or queen to d7, trying to hit the pawn, white's got a simple king to g3. It's not very often you see the king move up the board like this, but the point is, yeah, white has a few threats of his own, which involve, rook to h1 and knight to g5, and maybe even a possible f4 at some point. So yeah, this position is actually, in this exact position, slightly better for white because of the threats of immediate threats of rook to h1, knight to g5, etc. And going back to the position after king to g2, the other try for black is pawn to f4. But yeah, this doesn't cause white any problems, because after bishop to c1, yeah, black can't really get to the white king in this position. I mean, something like pawn to h5 would simply be ignored by rook to e1. The point being that if pawn takes h4, g4, sorry, pawn takes g4, black has no way of getting to the white king, and this pawn is going to be vulnerable in the long run. And queen to e8, for example, trying to come over to the king side to attack the white king, would simply be met by queen to c2, taking away the g6 square from the queen. And I have to say something like queen to e6. Yeah, the queen is not a very good blockader of. I mean, if you one of the common teams in these sorts of positions is anytime one side has a pass pawn, the side who's defending should try and block the pass pawn with a knight, and the queen's not the best piece to to try and blockade a pass pawn. But in this position, the other problem is there's this tactical move, queen to h6 check, when after king takes h7, so that was queen to h7 check, and after king takes h7, knight to g5 check, and regains material, and with a much better position. Okay, so going back to the position after king g2, we looked at pawn to f4, we looked at pawn takes g4. One last try for black in this position is probably queen to d7, and yeah, planning to capture on g4 now, and if pawn takes g4, queen takes g4, but here white just plays a simple knight to h2, and yeah, and yeah, this is a very, 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 I mean, white not only has a pass pawn, he can expand on the king side at some point, and pawn to f4 doesn't really do much because after bishop to c1, black has to find, well, black hasn't achieved anything in this position. He hasn't done anything about the pass pawn. He still has a piece out to play in the game, and he has no way of making progress on the king side. So yeah, this position I'd say is slightly better for white. So yeah, that was an interesting survey of the Scotch Gambit. If we were to recap, so after the opening moves in the Scotch Gambit, we looked at this variation with starting with bishop to c5, where white played pawn to c3, and we saw the standard response, knight to f6. Yeah, I mean, we also saw that pawn takes pawn wasn't very good because of bishop takes f7 check. And pawn to d3 also allowed white to gain, space on the queen side, and hence knight to f6 and the main line. But then after moves like e5 and pawn to d5, bishop to b5, and knight to e4, pawn takes d4, bishop to b6. Yeah, we saw interesting positions where, you could say they were dynamically equal. But as with all chess openings and a lot of chess openings, the side who's more familiar with the ideas and the plans and the types of position usually comes out on top. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And hope to see you on the next one.